Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We recently did a live stream on Monday, recapping pretty much, the entire Boston Miami series. So, this episode isn't going to be filled with that content, but if you're living under a rock, Miami did beat Boston in a 7-game series, and now they've advanced to the finals. So it is what it is, and the finals are heating up. But that's kind of old news. But if you do want to look at the Miami.
No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended. But if you do want to look at, that content, it is up on our channel under the live section. So, be sure to check that out. And before we get started with this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the OBT Podcast. But, the order of business today, we have to recap game 1 of the NBA Finals. So this was Denver's first game, I believe, in the finals, like franchise-wise, correct? So,
yes.
Yeah. So, big deal for Denver. I don't think enough people are going to talk about that, but, it is what it is. So, congrats to them for winning their first franchise finals game. They won this game 104-93. Big game, I think, historically, because I believe it was Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic who have now, I think, averaged, I can't remember the specific stat, so I'm kind of paraphrasing, but I think it was they're the only other duo besides like Magic Johnson and James Worthy or something like that to average 25 plus points through the entire playoff run. So hats off to those guys. And we do have to kick it off with the winners, and that was the Nuggets. And this was a huge game for the entire squad, I think. But to start with the leading scorer in Jokic, he had 27 points, 14 assists, 10 rebounds, a classic triple double. And he didn't shoot a lot until the second half, really, the fourth, honestly, he didn't really need to, because, this team is just able to walk over, it seems like, anybody they really want, I'm not saying, it was an easy walk for them against the Lakers, but, it was a sweep, but those games were fairly close. I do have to give LA credit from that point of view, but, Denver, they came out and showed us, that they're this might be their year. So, Jokic, he played 40 minutes, but, he didn't take a lot of shots, and he didn't need to because, like I said, he was spreading the ball around. He had 14 assists, 10 rebounds. He got his. Then you have Jamal Murray, who's been a stellar second option and sometimes even first option for this Denver team throughout these playoffs. He had 26 points, so 1 point shy of Jokic, but, he also had 10 assists. So, the ball was being spread around a lot through these guys. And, Jamal Murray also had 6 rebounds to go along with that. I thought he had a very good game, very explosive. He's a great shot creator, hits all kinds of tough shots. Really a huge matchup nightmare, I think, for Miami as well. I think everybody on this team pretty much is a matchup nightmare for Miami. Then we go into Michael Porter Jr., the unicorn. 14 points, 13 rebounds, huge deal for him. Miami seems like they don't really have an answer for him unless he honestly just misses. He's able to shoot over pretty much anybody who was trying to contest him. And he had some pretty emphatic dunks, including one where Bam was on the chase down. And, Bam tried to get there, but just a case of, just got there too late. But yeah, Michael Porter Jr., freak athlete, also great shooter. So hats off to him for having a decent game. Then Aaron Gordon, 16 points. He came out hot in the first quarter. I was like, wow, that's interesting. Because, they were kind of leaving him open at some points. I guess they don't really trust his shot. It seems like he doesn't trust his either, but he's still able to beat people by using his size, athleticism, even quickness too. So, and he had some pretty emphatic dunks as well. So he had 16 points, 1 assist, 6 rebounds. Bruce Brown Jr., 10 points, pretty good. 5 rebounds, definitely a big game for him. I think, if he can continue that level of play, and I'm sure it'll only get better, off the bench, I think that's what you want. And then obviously KCP had 7 points, 3 rebounds, not, too crazy, but still enough. But yeah, I mean, Denver just seems like they're on a roll, man. Like, I know, like, from 3, they didn't shoot that well, but overall, I think, the biggest thing with this team is they're bigger than Miami. Miami doesn't have a lot of size, and that's at every position pretty much. So it's a matchup nightmare, and I think, the hard thing is, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that Miami probably can't go 7 games and come out of this and win with the size disadvantage that they're at. And then, if we look at the Heat, Bam had a huge game, I thought, offensively. 26 points, excuse me. 5 assists, 13 rebounds. That's the kind of aggressiveness you want from him. But it seems like this team is so inconsistent with who's going to go off and who's going to show up. Because then, we look at Jimmy Butler, only 13 points, 7 assists, 7 rebounds. Gabe Vincent, decent game, 19 points, 5 assists, 2 rebounds. Caleb Martin cooled way the heck off. He's down to chilling temperatures. He had 3 points, 4 rebounds, and he also got the start, which was interesting. I found it interesting that they, tried to carry over his momentum from the Boston series. But we'll talk about, I guess some of the factors in this game specifically. And then Strus had 0. So, these guys seem like they may have cooled off. To me, Kyle Lowry, 11 points, 5 assists, 5 rebounds. It was all right. Highsmith, he did step up, but just wasn't enough. You need the other guys to step up, like Robinson, specifically, really Caleb Martin. I think that's one of. I'm not going to say he's the main reason they lost this game, but he's one of them because without his 20 points, you're missing a lot of scoring, and it's like it could have been a different thing if Hero was there. We may never know, but Hero's supposed to be coming back. But I think the big thing is with this Denver squad, and just Denver in general, it's that altitude. It's hard to play in that altitude, and you got to keep in mind also, Miami's coming off a 7-game series. They just won 7 games with Boston, so that's my take on it. I think Miami's just kind of slow right now. They're not adjusted to the environment completely, and Denver's been rested. They're ready. And like I said, it seemed like, once they swept LA, it kind of seemed like this was their year. But, what were your thoughts on this game? Because as a whole, I thought it was kind of a boring game, honestly. A little, I kind of expected more, but, like I said, fatigue and the environment does play a factor.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about this on the live stream where we kind of debated like, whether or not Denver coming in, not having played in a little bit versus Miami being fresh off a 7-game series, was that going to matter? And I was
Right.
like, I think Denver may look a little, rusty like initially and then just kind of pull away, but Denver
Mm-hmm.
pretty much from tip was pretty sharp.
Yeah.
Um I think like some of it just you can obviously mention like the fatigue plays a factor for Miami coming off a 7-game series, but like you said, some of the matchup problems just in terms of lack of size for Miami, right? That was an issue, right? Because like you said, Aaron Gordon, right? Denver clearly to start off the game, put Aaron Gordon in actions where he was just attacking their smaller guys around
Right.
the basket, right? And that's his strength, right? He's not a great outside shooter. You don't really want him handling the ball a ton, right? You just
Mm-hmm.
want him to, you just want his offense to be relatively simple, right? And that's what was going on early, right? Jokic, like you said, he, made his stamp on the game without even really taking a lot of shots, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had 3 shots, I think, at halftime, and Denver was up by what, like 15, 16?
Yeah.
I think it was 42 to 59. So I guess a 17-point lead, basically. So, I mean, overall, Jamal Murray and Jokic, right? They were the 2 best players on the floor, clearly, right? Bam had a great game, for the most part, and I think that was kind of an X factor we mentioned where he needed to be better against Denver,
Mm-hmm.
than he was against Boston, which I think he will be, and you could see that early on, right? He was attacking,
Aggressive.
right? 'Cause again, Boston, Denver's defense isn't the same as Boston's, even though it's not, bad necessarily at all, right? But I think Boston just has a little bit more flexibility there.
Sure.
But at the same time, right, Denver's also not the same as Boston, right? Miami was able to play zone against Boston and it worked, right?
Right.
Because Boston's offense was pretty much either threes or at the rim, right? Which, again, that is kind of an analytics thing for the most part. But at the same time, as we've seen, you have to be able to make other types of shots outside of that. And Denver, that's kind of the difference here, is kind of like similar to the LA series where, Miami can probably keep it close and keep it competitive at times, but it just does feel like Denver can kind of just get whatever shot they want, right? We saw, Jamal Murray making all types of shots, right, in the first half.
Right.
Well, for most of the game, honestly, right, but mainly through the first 3 quarters, right? Jokic got it going late, right? Michael Porter Jr. chipped in, as we mentioned. Aaron Gordon chipped in, Bruce Brown,
Yep.
and that's kind of the difference here is that with Miami, you also look at the shooting, right? They were really hot from three against Boston, right? In I think 3 of the 4 wins, they were shooting like 50% from three. They just didn't shoot well enough from three in this game, right? Specifically, like you mentioned, Max Strus, um, Caleb Martin, Duncan Robinson. Martin only took 2 threes, but he was still 1 of 7 from the field. Strus was 0 for 10.
Yeah.
A lot of them like pretty decent looks, but they just
Yeah.
weren't falling. Um, Robinson's looks were a little bit tougher, but still, they didn't really take a ton of bad shots. It was just, again, like shot making is a huge factor when it comes to playoff games in addition to the defense, right? Because it wasn't like Denver had 120 points. Um,
Right.
but for most of the game, it felt like their offense was, pretty good, right? Even though the 3-point shooting wasn't really there, right? And that's another factor where, like, Denver shoots a little bit better from three, right? Maybe it's a blowout. If Miami shoots a little bit better from three, maybe they win. But that's kind of the thing I think for the most part is that it just feels like Denver's offense is just better than Miami's.
Right.
Even though again, like there are things that we saw Miami do in the second half to help them get back in it. Right, we saw Haywood Highsmith play. Right, he came in with some energy. Right, he added some athleticism. Right, which you weren't getting from Strus and Robinson. Right, Lowry played a lot more in the second half. Right, he just overall just gave you better guard play than what they were getting. And Tyler Hero, we'll see if he makes a difference. Right, supposedly he could be back for game two, but I feel like it might be more likely game three. We'll see. Um, and then Butler, right? He just didn't have a great game in this game, right? Only 13 points, 6 of 14, right? So not terribly inefficient, right? But just in a game where like it got close, but it felt like Denver was probably still gonna pull away at the end. You just needed him to be better.
Right.
Um, but again, it's tough, right? Because I mean, he's sometimes getting to his spots, right? But it's just not working. So maybe they can make some adjustments there offensively, right? Maybe we'll see some different guys play. It feels like Love is probably just out of the rotation, but
Probably.
again, even if he was starting, then he's on Aaron Gordon, and it's like, is that really great? Probably not.
No.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, I think that there are things that Miami can do. We saw Highsmith, but then at the same time, like you still need some more size, right? And like Zeller, he just hasn't really worked
Right.
this postseason for the most part, right? I know he's a big body, right, but he just doesn't really give you
Doesn't
much when
fit.
Bam's off the court. Yeah, it's just not working, right? You just needed a big that was probably better on both ends of the floor, right? He can roll sometimes, right, but still, he's not giving you anything on offense and
Right.
not really giving you much on defense or on the boards, honestly.
Mm-mm.
Um, you just need a better option, but they don't have that. So, kind of like the Lakers, right? The Lakers probably needed a little bit more size, mainly at the guard spot, right? Because Miami has the wings,
Right. Yeah, for
I
sure.
guess, right? Because Butler's big. Martin's kind of small, right? But, still, he's a pretty decent athlete. Highsmith, he's pretty solid as a wing,
Yeah.
right? But just, again, you just need more. You probably just need like another big out there, and I kind of felt like that way against the Lakers as well, right? Just having another guy who can get you some extra rebounds, battle for some extra possessions. But I feel like also just Denver's probably just the better team, and we felt that way going in, right? Denver's been undefeated at home in the playoffs. That still hasn't changed, obviously, with this win, and Miami has to get at least one in Denver in order to win the series. So we'll see again. Maybe you factor in, all right, Struess probably doesn't shoot 0 for 10 next game, right?
Right.
Caleb Martin, 1 for 7. But again, like, keep in mind, like, and this is where shooting and, semi luck plays a factor, right? Where Caleb Martin, what did he average? Right close to 20 or whatever against Boston, and he shot like 60% from the field, right?
Yeah.
That's just that's just not a sustainable
Can't do
percentage,
that.
right? Again, like it's not his fault, right? But he was bound to have like a, back to reality type of game. It just kind of is unfortunate that it happened in this game, right? Because again, all you needed is one in Denver. But at the same time, they have a chance, I think, to win next game. But it does feel like Denver, has just overall just has more flexibility, has more options, just more guys that they trusted that they can rely on, that they can get, more offense. Again, we saw late in the game, right? Miami took away the two-man game with Jokic and Murray, right? No more dribble handoffs, no more pick and roll, right? But then what did they do? They just jumped the ball to Jokic, right, to just kind of create around the post area.
Right.
Um, and that's just kind of the thing that's really tough with Denver is again, we saw them front Jokic and try to take him out of the offense in the first half, right? But what was he doing? Distributing the ball, getting it to other guys, and Miami was
Right.
getting killed, right? Then in the second half, they're playing home on the other guys. Miami's going back to zone. And then what does Denver do? Dump it into Jokic, right? And he just kind of takes the game over and just closes it out. So there's just not a lot of great options if you're Miami defensively. Um, and your offense base still has to have a decent baseline level in order to win. Again, I mean, for most of the game, their offense was pretty rough. It didn't really click until the fourth quarter, right? The fourth quarter probably hides the splits, the shooting splits for them, which were probably a lot worse, right, going into the fourth, right? Because that's where a lot of their shots were made. They
Right.
had because 30 in the fourth quarter, and they were pretty much hovering around 20 a quarter um, through the first three, right? Which is just, it's just not good enough, right? You go into the fourth quarter and you only really have, I guess, what, 63 points? That's probably just not good enough against Denver. You just got to be better on offense because you're probably not going to stop Denver too much. Because we even saw with the Lakers, right? There were stretches where they played great defense, but Denver just knocked down some tough shots, and just couldn't keep up with them offensively. So,
Right.
and I don't expect, and I expect that to continue with Miami as well, because I don't feel like Miami is quite as good as LA in terms of their top line talent. Um, so I mean, maybe Miami. I feel like again with Jimmy Butler and Bam, maybe they should be good enough to get a game. But it wouldn't shock me if just every game, kind of like the LA game, is relatively competitive, but they just don't have enough to win. Um, and that's again credit to the undrafted guys from Miami, right? But sometimes, right, that's kind of what can happen, right, in the game like the finals, where sometimes like they're just not going to show up.
Sure.
And again, we saw against Boston, right? Miami was able to win because they got contributions from everybody, right? And if they don't get those contributions, it's going to be a really quick series.
Yeah.
But either way, you know, we picked Denver going into the series, so this type of game doesn't really surprise me because again, going in, I figured Denver's size, Denver's skill level is probably just too much for Miami, especially at home. Um, and again, Denver has been better on the road, right, than we thought going into the
Mm-hmm.
playoffs. So that's also a factor, right? So, I feel like for Miami, if they don't win game two, they're probably not going to win the series.
Heck no. Yeah, I agree. We kind of have to look at it. I think we said this. I can't remember if we said this in the live or the last episode, but we did kind of compare the two routes that these teams have had to go through, and people are forgetting that this Miami team, they are the underdogs at the end of the day. They've been the underdogs throughout the entire playoffs. And that story's continued all the way to the finals. And if this is probably one of the better playoff runs that we've seen from a team. I think, in Miami, that is, from them to, you know, basically almost be bounced out of the play-in to, we're in the finals now, which is insane. So, regardless of what the outcome is, it's hats off to them, but they need to step up their play and specifically, like you said, their role players, because, you can't have a game where Struess,
As well as
um,
Jimmy.
yeah, as well as Jimmy for sure, because, when Jimmy doesn't play well and other guys don't play well, that's kind of a recipe for disaster for this squad. But like Struess and Caleb Martin, they need to step up for sure because without their scoring, it just goes to show you that they're not as lethal as a team. That I don't know. It's hard to judge this Miami team just because they're such an underdog. If you know what I'm trying to say, it's
Sure.
rough because you
Eight
know
seeds don't normally win a title.
exactly, and you at the end of the day, I feel like everybody in their heart of hearts wants them to win, but it's
Yeah.
hard because Denver is such a good squad and they've got everything going for them, and even if you look at like
Number one seed.
exactly, they're the number one seed, and then if you look at how aggressive they were, I feel like Miami was aggressive, and they did take some good shots, but like you said, they weren't falling. But they didn't get to the line either. Miami only had
No.
2 free throws versus
Playoff record low.
exactly. So that shows you, there was a lack of aggression, I guess, from that standpoint. But in terms of the shots they were taking, a lot of them were good shots. They just didn't fall. But Denver, they had 16. They made 16 out of their 20 free throws. So that also goes to show you they were kind of paint mashing and using that size to their advantage. And that's something I think that people really need to drill down on. Is that size disadvantage because that could really be the main reason that this Heat team loses.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating, right? Because we've seen teams, the last several years, right, since, Golden State's kind of era of dominance, right,
Hmm.
go small. We've
Right.
seen teams, right, kind of just tried out much smaller lineups, right, where, guys who would, in previous eras probably be like, threes, now they're fours, right? Guys that were in previous eras fours, now they're fives. Um, and, you just can't really do that against Denver, right? Because they're pretty much big at basically every position, right?
Yep.
Jamal Murray's a pretty big for a point guard, right? Caldwell Pope is, pretty decent size for a two guard. Michael
Hmm.
Porter Jr. is ginormous as a small
Unicorn,
forward.
man.
He's pretty much taller than everybody in Miami's rotation other than Cody Zeller, and he's the small forward, right?
Exactly.
Aaron Gordon, he's, relatively big guy for a four. I think he's about 6'9", and then obviously Jokic, 7 feet, 300 pounds, basically. So, I mean, it's gonna be interesting, right? Because obviously, we can't do too much of a look ahead necessarily right until the finals is over, but I do kind of wonder going forward, are we going to see more of a trend to maybe like just more bigger lineups from other teams? Because again,
Right.
like regardless of what happens in in these finals, right? Denver's not going anywhere. So obviously, if you're a team in the Western Conference or if you're in the East, right, you got to figure out a way to contend with this Denver team, right? It's really tough to go small against them, and we've seen like even teams that have tried to kind of like punish them defensively, right? Like it just hasn't worked for the most part. Maybe if we saw, you know, another team, right, that maybe has a guard, right, that can operate in the pick and roll against Jokic, or attack Jamal Murray. We just haven't seen that yet. And I don't think Miami can necessarily do that either, right? Because again, we
Sure.
saw Bam attack, go downhill, right, or just attack Jokic, right? And again, he had his way. He had 26 points, on a pretty efficient night, right? But again, outside of that, no one else really did a whole lot around the basket.
Right.
I mean, so that's kind of just going to be an interesting factor going forward. Is just like you mentioned the size discrepancy. It's very clear, right, that Miami's a little bit too small, and they don't really have they don't have too many other additional options because again they put out Cody Zeller. He didn't really do anything. Love didn't play, but I mean he's probably not going to do a whole lot either. Um, I guess he's bigger than some of the other guys they have,
Sure.
right? But still, um, I don't know. I just don't think you have any options. Obviously, you can't trot out Haslam, right? He's probably
Right.
not going to give you a whole lot.
No.
So, um, but like you said, you do have to kind of factor in the paths that they got there, with Miami being, an 8 seed, right? Like you said, they're the underdogs, right? We didn't pick them to win because we thought that Denver's better. They're the 1 seed. They've pretty much been better all year, right? They have
Right.
the best player on the floor, um, right? So I mean, if you have the best player on the floor and you got a good team, right? And you're the 1 seed, you're at home. I mean, this is a series you should win. So I mean, like Denver should win this series, right? I don't really see much of a pathway for Miami to win unless Jimmy Butler, right, just has a crazy, 4 games, right, where he just, ends up again, he's the best player on the floor and he gets help.
Yeah.
Cuz I mean, there could be a game where Jimmy Butler has like 37, 42 or something like that, right? And they still lose, right? Cuz
Right.
again, it's just you got to have more guys show up, and I just don't know if Miami's offense can really do that because their offense has been up and down.
Yeah.
Maybe Hero comes in and changes that, right? Because
Will it
again,
be
he's
enough
a
though?
solid.
Because he's also a
Yeah,
bad
he's
defender.
yeah, exactly. That's the issue, right? But again, it does give you more options where you can probably bench one of the other guys, right? That's not
Sure.
really giving you a whole lot, right? Like maybe you might decide between Struess or Duncan Robinson, and you kind of just put one of those guys to the side so you can get more Highsmith minutes out there.
Sure.
So again, we'll see, right? Because again, Hero can change the series because he's a good player, he's a solid
Yes.
player. Like you said, is it enough? I don't know. I mean, if he plays in game one, do they win? Maybe, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, because
Yeah.
they lost by 11, but I mean, in fairness, for a good chunk of the game, they were down by more than that. So,
Yes. They just were not.
um,
They were persistent and they didn't really fade away in the fourth.
yeah, exactly. They hung around for most of the game, but it was pretty clear from the jump that Denver, was
Yeah.
better and they were probably going to win. Again, like I said, maybe Hero can change that because again, he's certainly good enough to,
For sure.
alter your team's fortunes in a playoff game. But I just don't know because again, like you said, he's also not a great defender. And part of the issues with the Lakers, right, was that they had a couple of guys, right, like say D'Lo, right, where the Denver guards were just attacking him
Exactly.
relentlessly. And I would imagine, right, same thing, right? Even though he's 6'5", right, he's got short arms, he's not that much of an athlete. So you would think, right, Jamal Murray would attack him. You would think Bruce Brown would probably attack him, right? So I
Hmm.
mean, that's the issue, right? Because that's the issue for Miami is that they're small, even though they are tough, they do play hard. But I just don't know if they're good enough.
Right.
Again, props to them for getting here. But this is why 8 seeds don't normally win in it. Well, I don't think. Yeah, they. I don't know if they've ever won a title, but this is why they don't normally win one
Sure.
because again, you're going, especially if you're going up against a 1 seed, because you're probably going to be undermanned, overwhelmed, and just not good enough, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're still better than we thought because they got all the way to the finals. They did have some breaks, right? With Giannis's injury, um, but still, right? Every team that gets this far has at least a few breaks.
Right.
Even Denver, right? Like Phoenix, right? They had guys go down. Maybe they still beat Phoenix anyways, but again, every team that gets this far always has a few breaks go their way, right? Luck always plays a factor into a title. You
Yep.
still have to be good, of course. Um, But, again, Miami has had some luck go their way, and they've been good enough to win a lot of these games, but they just
Sure.
may not be good enough against Denver. And, that, like you said, it sucks because it's like, hopefully it's a more competitive finals and not just a sweep.
Yeah, because I
Because
was kind of bored out of my mind watching this game. I'm not gonna lie.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's not because, and it's certainly not because Denver's a boring team. I just think,
Mm-mm.
with Miami, it's kind of clear like that they're probably just not good enough.
It's written in the
Right?
stars to me.
Yeah, exactly. Like if it was Bucks Nuggets,
Holy.
obviously that'd be a different matchup.
Yeah.
But still, regardless, I think that's kind of just the difference here is that, like you said, Miami's guys have to step up, but are they going to be able to step up? We've seen them do it against other teams, and it's not like Denver's a lockdown defensive team, but you know, that's kind of the difference. Because, like you said, and like I said, they got a lot of good looks.
Oh yeah.
I didn't necessarily think that their offense was too terrible. They
Mm-mm.
had some stretches, right, where some of their shots, I thought were pretty difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But there were also other stretches where guys had wide open shots, right? Like Miami, they had a fast break opportunity. Max Strus wide open at the 3-point line, even takes a dribble to set his feet, just can't knock it down. I
Exactly.
mean, and it's again, even though it sounds cliche, sometimes it is a make or miss league, right? And that was what happened with Boston and Miami, right? Where, Miami was just, they couldn't miss against Boston, right? They had 350% from 3 games. And, again, if you shoot that well from three, you're probably going to win. But you can't do that. But, can you do that against Denver?
Ah,
Maybe. But even so, it's not like Denver has to shoot that great from three in order to win. Because, again, they only shot 29% tonight, right?
right.
Boston has to shoot well from three in order to win. We've seen some games where Miami won, even though they didn't shoot well. But I feel like for Miami to beat Denver, their offense is going to have to be way better. Their defense wasn't too bad, considering they were outmatched in terms of the size, even though there were stretches where Denver was hitting everything and getting some relatively easy looks. But,
Sure.
I think the offense is what's primarily going to have to step up. Because, again, even if you play great defense again, if you shoot 40% from the field, 33% from three, and you only go to the line a couple times, that's not going to cut it. You're not going to win that game.
Yeah. And that was kind of the story of that game, honestly. Hang on, my camera's messed up. I don't know why it's not
So,
focusing.
yeah. So I guess I guess for a semi look ahead for game
Yeah.
2, right? Game 2, that's Sunday, right? Again, once again in Denver. Who are we feeling like is probably gonna win that game? We're feeling Denver.
Oh, yeah. For me, it's Denver 100%.
I Yeah, they haven't lost at home.
Yeah.
Um, right, and it feels like that should continue. Again, maybe Miami gets a hot shooting game, better effort from some of these guys, and they pull it out. But again, it's do or die, right? Pretty much for Miami, because I feel like if they lose game 2, they're probably going to lose the series. Obviously, 2-0 isn't the end necessarily, right? But we know statistically, usually you win 80% of the time when you go up 2-0, and the
Yeah.
path only gets harder. Obviously, Miami will have a chance to tie up the series at home if they lose game 2. But again, they still have to win in Denver, and ideally, you'd like to win one of the first two.
Sure.
Just because, again, you'd rather go into Miami with a split than go into Miami down 0-2, where if you lose one game in Miami, the season and the series is over.
Yes.
Um, but again, it's like we said going in, it's a hard task because Denver's a better team. Right? They're bigger, they're more skilled, right? Some of their best guys are better, right? Obviously Jokic is better than any of Miami's guys. I would say I think he's the best player on the floor, and I don't think that's a
No
hot take.
argument. Probably the best in the
Exactly.
league, honestly.
Yeah, and then you got Jamal Murray, right? Butler's probably better than Jamal Murray, but at the same time, Jamal Murray can, any given night can have huge games, right? Especially being able to play off of a guy like Jokic, right?
Exactly.
That's kind of the other thing that factors in as well as his ability to play off of a superstar. And like you said, being a great number two option where he can create offense on his own, or for others, right? He doesn't necessarily have to play like a normal point guard, right? He can just be a combo guard and, look to score.
Right.
Um, and then right, Bam, probably the fourth best guy, I would say. Um, and then after that, right, I would say the next several guys that are better are probably Denver's guys, right? Um,
Yeah.
Depending on Caleb Martin, right? I mean, if we're getting the Caleb
Sure.
Martin from Boston, obviously that's a different factor, right? But
Right.
after that, it's just kind of slim pickings from there. So, Jimmy has to step up. Other role players got to step up. They can't shoot that badly again. Um, if they shoot that badly again, they're going to lose.
Yeah.
So, like I said, that's kind of the difference here. But again, as we saw with the Lakers, right? Because we kind of thought when the Lakers lost that first game against Denver, that it was that they would probably win game 2 because we were like they shot so poorly and they still got back into the
I
game,
thought
but
they
then they
figured
lost
him
game
out.
2. Exactly, but then they lost game 2, right?
Right.
Because again, every time down the stretch, Denver was able to find ways to get it done. And again, that's the difference between them and Boston, right? Boston all year was a bad team, one of the worst in crunch time. Denver's one of the best.
Yeah.
Um, that's the issue, right? Miami isn't necessarily going to be able to just kind of clutch close games out the way they were able to against Boston. Because this Denver team, again, it's well coached, well prepared, very talented, and that again, that's kind of the key here for the most part. I mean, I know it sounds like we're kind of rambling and repeating the same stuff, but sometimes that's kind of how simple it can be. Sometimes a
Right.
team can just be better, and if they're better enough at certain things, right, they're probably going to win more often than not. And that's kind of the difficulty for Miami in this series is that you're going to have to go in and beat a better team.
Yeah.
And can they do it? You know, maybe, but I would probably aim towards probably not. But again, as we've seen many times, you don't always want to overreact to game 1, but either way, sometimes game 1 can still kind of set the tone for
Yes.
a series, right? Like we saw in game 1 with the Lakers and the Nuggets. That set the tone where the Lakers could keep it close, right? But Denver would always pull it out. Right? Miami, right? They set the tone in games 1 and 2 against Boston, right? Where, I think when Miami won game 1, we didn't think that meant they were going to win the series, but we did see factors, right, where Miami was better because they were better in crunch time, right? Because
Yeah.
Boston was up for a good chunk of those first 2 games. And then, at the end of the game, all of a sudden Miami pulls it out and you're like, wow, Miami, it didn't feel like they were going to win. And then they did. So that's kind of the difference here. Denver's a different beast. And I think it's pretty clear that, of the teams this season, I think that they were probably the league's best team this year. And if they finish it off with a title, right, then that more than proves it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, from Miami's point of view, like, you know, eh, their keys to victory are so unfortunate because it's a lot of impossible tasks because we saw them try and stop Jokic and take him out of the game and like you said hinder that two-man game, but the problem is they were throwing all kinds of doubles at Jokic in the post, but the problem is if you double Jokic he's going to find the open man, and sometimes he may find somebody who's not even open but somebody off of a rotation or a cut. It's just
Yeah.
crazy. It's hard to double such a high IQ player like that and try and take him out the game because they took him out of the game, I guess, shot
Yeah.
wise,
He only had
yeah,
3 shots at half.
yeah. They limited, the amount of field goals that he was attempting.
Yeah.
Cool, that's cool, but you're not gonna limit his impact, i.e., the assists, the ability to get to the line, and the rebounds.
And
It's hard. It's
Yeah, and
impossible.
some of that's also just the gravity. Because people have mentioned, gravity with other guys. Usually you hear the gravity argument mainly with Steph, I think.
Yes.
Um, right, but we've seen other superstars, have those type of gravities where, just when they're just by them being out there on the floor, right, it just makes everybody better, right?
Yeah.
Because again, he only had 3 shots at halftime, and they're up by almost 20. Because every time, even if he's doubled, right, like you said, there's so much attention being put on him, it just leaves somebody else wide open. And again, Denver's guys are good enough where if you leave them open, they'll make you pay,
Yeah.
right? Michael Porter Jr. was 2 of 11 from three, but he still, again, he attacked the basket at different points, crashed for offensive boards. We saw them, again, feed the ball through Aaron Gordon right through the early part of the game, right? Jamal Murray obviously got it going, taking
Hmm.
advantage of those, Jokic traps. And again, that's kind of the thing is that,
Big deal.
again, and we've seen it, right? Jokic doesn't have to have like a crazy high scoring game in order for
No.
Denver to, win games. Actually, honestly, Denver's probably at their best when everybody's contributing, right? When he has a game where he's got somewhere around 20, right? And but he's got like, again, double digit assists, double digit rebounds, right? Those are the type of games, right, where Denver just feels like they're unstoppable
Yep.
when everybody's going off. I guess you could say that about a lot of teams, right? But Denver especially just because there's a lot of guys that can do a lot of different things in that starting five. Um, and like you said, it's just a tall task for Miami. It's the toughest matchup they've had. Honestly, even more so than say Milwaukee, right? Because
Hmm.
obviously, you have Giannis out there, right? But he wasn't necessarily healthy for all those games. Um, and Milwaukee's style of play was different, right? And at times they were, sometimes the coaching just, at late in the game, just for whatever reason, just wasn't good enough. Um, and then, obviously the Knicks, right? Completely different story. Boston, same thing. So it's their toughest task, and usually that's what it is by the time you get to the final.
Sure.
It's also kind of interesting because going into the playoffs, or maybe not going into the playoffs, but there was a point I think at maybe around the midway point of the season where a lot of people were kind of saying that the Western Conference felt like it wasn't very good. Um, and I never felt like that. I just
Me
felt like
neither.
there were a lot of good teams. That kind of muddied up the records versus everybody just being kind of like average or mediocre,
Right.
right? But I mean, it's pretty clear that the Western Conference, I think, was the better conference
Easily.
this
More
postseason, right?
competitive.
Exactly, more competitive. I mean, you just had a lot of really good teams out there. And
And we
again,
talked
like the
about that
Lakers.
before the playoffs even started, to be honest. I
Yeah,
think.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right? Because we saw a team like Memphis, who was the 2 seed, they lost in the first round. We saw the Lakers, right, get to the conference finals, beating better teams, and then get swept in the conference finals by Denver. Right?
Right.
We saw Phoenix still give Denver 6 games. I mean, again, like the Western Conference, I feel like I feel like it's pretty clear. I think they're the better conference. Obviously, you still have some really good teams at the top of the East, but I mean the West is just a different animal because there's so many good teams, right? Because it feels like with the East it kind of bottoms out after maybe like 4 or 5 teams, right?
Sure.
Because you have, of course, Milwaukee, right? Boston, Philly. You got to add Miami, of course, too, who wasn't a top four team in the East for pretty much any point in the season, but you got to throw them in there.
Yep.
But then after that, right? Like who else? Um, Cleveland, right? They didn't show much in the playoffs, even though they were a good regular season team.
Nope.
The Knicks were a solid team, right? But they weren't really looked at as like, a real contender. Um, and then after that, right? I mean, who else?
Nobody.
I guess, yeah, exactly. Not, yeah, Atlanta. I mean,
No.
not really. Yeah,
No.
mediocre. Chicago, not really.
Nope.
Toronto, definitely not. So, I mean, I think that's kind of like, the themes that we're seeing here is that definitely the West is better. Denver, I feel like, has kind of, made their case for like, hey, we might be the best team in basketball right now. Of course, again, things went different teams' ways, right? But for now, they're kind of showing that. And,
Yeah.
again, like we've talked about it before where it was really interesting how, they were the 1 seed for a good chunk of the regular season, but it never really felt like they were the obvious pick to come out of the West.
Right.
I mean, and I didn't necessarily think going in that there was an obvious pick. But
They
either
weren't the
way,
one
right?
for me.
Yeah, exactly. You would just yeah, it's just most years, right? Usually the 1 seed or the 2 seed is usually the one that comes out. It just didn't. It just felt kind of weird, but I think they kind of threw us off their scent in a way because they had that stretch where they just clearly just weren't really in it and didn't really
Yeah.
care. And in fairness, you can do that when you're the 1 seed because they had a
You
huge
have the
advantage.
leeway.
Yeah, they had a huge edge in the win column, which we forget because at one point I think they had an 8 game lead in the Western Conference win column, right? And obviously that trickled down, and dropped after a while, but still, right? They were clearly very good. It's just they've kind of raised their game in the playoffs, but for them it's also interesting just because, right? They were the team where they lost to the Lakers in the bubble, and it felt like they were on the up and up. Where we were like, yeah, this team's not going anywhere. They're here to stay. They're sticking around. And then they had, the 2 years where Jamal Murray's hurt, Michael Porter Jr.'s hurt, and they were just kind of like erased out of everybody's memory in a way, right?
Sure.
So, it just kind of goes to show, right? We can't forget that, this team had always been really good. It's just now they're finally healthy and now they have a chance to show like, we're right there with anybody.
Yeah. They've had a
And
huge
again,
development.
exactly. And it feels I think this is how the rest of the finals is going to go. Obviously Miami can still win, some games. I would be pretty surprised if Miami won this series. I mean,
Yeah, I doubt
I
it.
just I just think what Miami has to do in order to win the series is just not quite as sustainable. And I think that's kind of one of the major keys you know, is what you do each game sustainable? I think Denver's is, right? Because they were getting a lot of easy shots from everywhere. Whereas Miami, right, they really struggled offensively. And, like I said, I feel like I'm pretty confident that's how that's going to go. Again, we've been wrong about some of these other series for sure. But at this point, I think this is pretty much the right pick. And Denver's the clear, was looked at going into the series as the clear favorites. Like not too much of this is a shocker. It's just, you just have to kind of see it, so that way you can talk about it and
Sure.
discuss it, right? Because
Yes.
you just never know, right? But this one I was pretty sure about going in.
Right. I agree 100%.
Um, so I guess, now that we've kind of, done our talk about game one, we kind of did a little bit of a look ahead to game two, right? Obviously, we don't want to go any further than that because a
Yeah.
lot of things can change in that amount of
Sure.
time, right? Because it's no longer every other day, right? Because obviously, by the time everybody sees this episode, it'll be Friday, right? But the
Yep.
next game won't be until Sunday.
Yep.
So I guess now we can get into some of the news because a lot of things have happened. Leading up to today since the last time we all spoke together. So the first order of business, Bob Myers. It seems like he's now, well, not seems like he is stepping down from
Hmm.
Golden State. Um, it didn't really seem like it was worded as he's stepping down, but maybe goes somewhere else. It seems like that might be it for him in
Yeah.
terms of just running, an organization. It'll be interesting. Obviously there was a lot of talk, going into this postseason and going into a lot of these discussions about, hey, it seemed like he wasn't, there wasn't like I guess a clear sense of agreement on what the pay should be, right?
Hmm.
Reportedly, he was sort of the middle of the pack in terms of the highest paid front office guys, which is kind of interesting. The front office guys' salaries aren't necessarily publicized, so I do kind of wonder who the number one executive is. My guess is it's probably Pat Riley, but of course, I don't really know for
Yeah,
sure.
probably due to tenure and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. But regardless, it seemed like there wasn't like a clear cut agreement in terms of what to be paid. He also seems like he probably is okay with moving on. Also, it seems like they want an internal hire. It seems like I think the owner's son or team governor's son, Kirk Lacob, is going to be promoted, which was kind of reported that an internal hire was probably the most likely to happen. Again,
Okay.
we don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with his decision making, but we know that the owner was kind of the guy driving the bus behind the idea of the two timelines, which
Right.
it seems like hasn't worked out since they won the title. Obviously, they won the title last year, right? But you know, with the way the young guys have looked now, it seems like that might have been a mistake, maybe the
Yeah,
wrong
they may
decision.
have
Of
jumped the
course,
gun.
yeah, hindsight is always 2020, right? But you look at Wiseman, he didn't really pan out. Um, Kaminga, right? He's been okay, right? But he hasn't been in the playoff rotation at all. Moody's been okay, right? Poole was really good last year and then took a step back. So I do wonder how this kind of affects the team because again, like you don't normally want to lose the smart guys or smart people in your organization, and he
Right.
seemed like he was one of the brightest. Obviously, I guess the last few years it probably hasn't been as great, right? Because the young guys, I'm assuming he was the driving factor behind those guys. It seems like they haven't panned out, but still, he has a good track record, right? And just in general, I would be pretty disappointed if I'm Golden State to lose this guy, because I'd be curious to see, if the team governor's son can really be a viable replacement, because I just feel like there's not much replacing 4 titles. Even though,
Sure.
again, there were other guys that helped as well, such as Jerry West, and of course the individual players themselves.
Yes. Um, and for me, I don't know. It's kind of a weird situation because I don't feel like they're necessarily in trouble. I feel like the future is definitely in question, like you said, because we don't know, what this guy is capable of. Um, but like you said, he's really a irreplaceable asset. He's somebody whose value literally has no number on it. I don't think he built that team. He got those guys there. He got Katie there. They won a lot, and he was the architect for that. So to see him go is kind of sad. And the fact, like you said, that it wasn't worded like he's looking at X, Y, and Z. It sounds like he might be done. And he might be okay with that. Because that he might go down as one of the the great. I'm pretty sure he probably is going to go down as one of the greatest GMs of all time. You know what I mean? So I don't know. It's an interesting situation, and I think that new hire is definitely going to be one to watch because like you said, Golden State's future is kind of up in the air, considering the young guys that they have to deal with. But they did have a tumultuous offseason, um, with the whole Jordan Poole incident. So I'm just curious, will we ever see the Warriors back in championship form? Like I feel like they're contending. As long as Steph is on that roster, they're going to be contending. As long as he's healthy, they're probably going to be in the playoffs. But will we ever see them in championship form again? Honestly, now that
That
Myers
yeah,
is gone.
Yeah, I almost feel like that's kind of where I'm leaning, where I don't
Right.
know if they can win another title. And also you have to
Exactly.
factor in with the new CBA, right? That makes, kind of upgrading this team a lot tougher as well,
Yeah.
right? Because they're in that super tax area, I think. So it makes it, super harder, or I guess more difficult
Yeah.
put together. a contending team, and I don't know if I would want to put that in the hands of a new GM, right? I feel like I would prefer to leave that to somebody with a lot more experience.
Right, a
Um,
resume.
exactly, but I don't know. You never know again because they had the talent to win the title last year, but it also feels like the league has gotten better, um, and they did not. And I
Right.
don't know if they necessarily catch up a whole lot to match these other teams because again, like it's just weird to say about a team that won the title last year, but sometimes this stuff kind of happens, right? Where you win a title and that might just kind of be it. We've seen dynasties in the past, right? They win titles and then they have like one more random trip, to the finals or something like that, and then
Right.
it just kind of fizzles out because again, their core is older, and that's something you have to weigh as well. In addition to that, CBA. So that's kind of the question here. They can keep the core, but the question is, what can they do to add more pieces around it?
Yes.
Right? Because the core, I think, is still good enough to contend, but you clearly need more because they didn't have enough clearly against the Lakers. Um, right? So, and obviously, the Lakers aren't the only team you're going to have to battle in the Western Conference next season, right? Because we also have to factor in there's going to be other teams that are probably going to make real tangible improvements, right? Teams, young teams like Oklahoma City,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just teams like that. Maybe other teams, right? Like say, maybe Dallas isn't really a young team, right? But they'll probably
They'll
be
be
a
in the
little better.
mix.
Yeah, Sacramento, maybe they get better, or even if they just kind of stay where they're at, that's still a good roster.
Denver will be
Um,
around.
yeah, Denver is not going anywhere, right? Phoenix will still be a competitive team, even if they're, not winning. Um, and even other teams, right? Like just in general, I mean, like that's the other thing you have to, because there were a lot of good teams that were in the Western Conference this year. And, some of those teams kind of fizzled out towards the end, right? Like, say, New Orleans was towards the top of the Western Conference earlier in the year, right? But, again, injuries obviously held that roster back. Kind of funny enough, it reportedly they're overhauling their training staff,
Oh wow.
which I guess, yeah, which they needed to do, right? Because obviously they've had bad luck in terms of injuries. We'll see if it's any, we'll see if it's effective at all. But just in general, that's the tough part because clearly Golden State wasn't good enough this year. So how do you get back to where they were last year,
Right.
right? You know,
Can you?
you know, yeah, can you? Right? Because again, you have to deal with the new rules that make it very difficult to add talent. So you have to draft well, which it hasn't seemed like they've been able to do the last couple of years, even with high draft picks. Um, and then you also got to find ways to just grab some quality players. And again, with very limited financial resources, right? Not because of them, right? But just because of the rules. That makes it tough as well. So,
Yep.
again, it sucks to lose Bob Myers, especially at a time like this when you feel like that they're maybe decent enough to make one more run,
And it's
right?
time
But you
for
look at that
decisions, Sorry.
exactly,
Yeah, it's decision time. And, to not have
exactly,
your prime decision maker be there, I think that's the scary thing.
right, exactly. So moving on, the other big piece of news that occurred, actually the other day. So Monty Williams, we talked about it before, right? Where it seemed like I was pretty confident he'd get another job.
Yeah,
Because again, even though it didn't end well in Phoenix, I still think he's a solid coach.
sure.
Um, and clearly the Detroit Pistons thought so as well. So he was offered, according to Woj and Shams, a 6-year, $78 million contract.
It's a lot of money,
Um,
man.
yeah, pretty much making him, I guess, the highest paid coach in the league, or certainly one of the highest, with incentives that could make that contract go up to 100 million.
That's crazy, man.
Yeah. So when I first saw that, I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty much in shock. Like,
Me too.
obviously, it didn't surprise me that he was gonna get hired because it was kind of reported like, it seems like he's seriously considering going there, right? Because initially it sounded like he turned it down, and that he might take some time off or something like that.
Right.
But of course, you can't say no to money.
No.
Um, but again, the thing with this contract, in fairness, that even though again it is quite ridiculous, at the same time, unlike with players, there is no salary cap for coaches, right? So in theory, you can basically spend as much as possible, as much as you want. Obviously, within reason in terms of what you can actually pay, but
Right.
it's not like the players where there's a clear salary cap, and there's lines that you just can't cross. But still, either way, like that's a lot of money for a head coach. But at the same time, right? If there's a guy that you want and you're not one of the premier teams, kind of like what it is with the other players, you're probably going to have to overpay in order to convince those guys to come, right? Because I don't think Detroit was the premier coaching destination, right? Because you still have,
No, no.
Phoenix. That's an option, although it seems like that may go to another guy. We'll get to that in a minute, but just in general, right? Like, either way, congrats to Monty Williams, right? Like again, because I still think he's a good coach. I still think I still think he can coach an NBA roster.
Hmm.
And unlike in Detroit, or excuse me, unlike in Phoenix, there's not going to be the same levels of expectations. Even though, of course, he's going to be, paid handsomely for what he's doing. But again, you got guys to work with, right? You got Cade Cunningham. You have what Jalen Duran. What's his name? Jaden Ivey, right?
Yep.
Yeah, Jaden Ivey.
Yes.
I almost said Killian Hayes for half a second. I don't think so.
Yeah. No.
Um,
Yeah. I don't think that's happening.
yeah.
Shout out to Jamal. He was right about that.
Right. Exactly. And just so you have some decent young players there. Right, and there's other guys there. Maybe they stick around, maybe they don't. Right, like a Wiseman, Marvin Bagley, guys like
Right.
that. Obviously, you'll have the incoming draft pick, right? Not the pick that they wanted, right? They wanted a higher pick, but still, um, again, this is kind of putting him in a position to where he was when he was first hired by Phoenix. I think he was hired by Phoenix in the 2019 offseason, right? So going into that bubble year, right, where, not real expectations, right? Because the roster wasn't that great. Young team, inexperienced team, just
Right.
kind of to right the ship, kind of be a culture setter, right? And then, Phoenix had a not so great regular season. Then they go into the bubble, they're undefeated in the bubble. And then before you know it, they're in the finals. So, obviously, like I said, I think he can coach. Obviously, there's some weaknesses with his coaching. It seems like adjustments wise, he's not the greatest at it. Um, but still, you don't have to necessarily hit a quote unquote home run when you're a team like a Detroit, right? Like you're probably not going to be able to get the perfect coach, but getting a coach in there, right, who's experienced with guys, right, clearly, has a decent track record as a head coach, right? He's coached other stars, and again, seems like a nice guy, a big
Yeah.
culture setter. I think this is a good hire for Detroit, despite the overpay, because
Yeah.
it is definitely a huge overpay, but again, it's not hurting you the way that overpaying for a player would, because again, there's no salary cap for coaches, because again, we've seen teams fire coaches and, they're paying a coach that's currently there and they're also, paying the new coach, right? Like say for Philly, right? Doc Rivers was fired, they're going to be paying him and they're going to be paying Nick Nurse, right? Same
Yeah.
for Milwaukee, right? They're going to be paying Budenholzer the rest of his contract. Um, and they'll be paying Nick Nurse. Even with the Lakers, right? They'll be paying Vogel the rest of his contract, and they're paying Darvin Ham. So, there's no limit to that. Just I guess depending on how much money you got in your pocket. So, what is your thoughts on this?
When I first heard it, I was shocked too. Number one, because of the money, but I was also shocked that I never really thought of Monty Williams, going to Detroit, and I was like, I was shocked that it actually, it works in my opinion. I think thinking it over because now we've had a few days to have it marinate, and I think it works because there's tremendous upside with Detroit, and I think they have what the fifth pick this year,
Yeah,
so they're gonna have
not as
another
high.
guy. Yeah, definitely not as high. It is a disappointment. Like we talked about, we did say that they were definitely one of the losers of the lottery, but nonetheless, it's still a high pick. And the fifth pick will do nothing but add to the young roster that you have. There are some guys there that need some developing, but there's also some really big talents there, like you said, Cade Cunningham. So I feel like Monty Williams is probably one of those guys. He's been to the finals before. He's had playoff teams as well. So I think he can add that sense of winning culture that Detroit is looking for because Detroit has been down in the dumps for years. Um, so I like the hire a lot, and like I said, I was shocked that I didn't think of it, sooner. And I was like, okay, well, that works in my opinion. So I'm not mad at it at all. But that number, that number is kind of wild. I think that definitely is a wild overpay. I feel like there's coaches in the league that definitely deserve that money more than Monty. Not to take anything away from Monty, but there are better coaches than Monty. But shout out to him because he got the check. And shout out to Detroit because they definitely got a good coach.
Exactly. So I guess as a head coach, right? He is in 703 games, right? 367, 336. So that's a little over 50%,
Hmm.
right? But with Phoenix, obviously that run was much better, right? I
Yeah.
mean, other than the first year, right? They were pretty much, winning way over 500. I guess,
Yeah,
this year not so much, but everybody in the Western Conference other than the top teams, right, had relatively mediocre records, right? But
sure.
34 and 39 the first year, 51 and 21 the next year with a finals trip, then 64 and 18 last year, 45-37 this year, right? But
Right.
at the same time, you had the playoff issues, right, where you got to the finals a couple seasons ago, right? And then last year you flamed out against Dallas in game
Yeah, that was
7,
rough.
right? And then against Phoenix, right? Or excuse me, and then against Denver, right? You flamed out in game 6,
Right.
where, both games were basically over, relatively quickly. So, again, he's going to have his hands full because it's not like Detroit's obviously a great team. But at the
No.
same time, again, there's no real pressure. You're coaching a lot of young guys that are looking to learn,
Yeah.
looking to grow with experience. So it should be, I guess in a way, maybe more fun. Obviously, I guess you'd like to win. But at the same time, right, Phoenix was getting their heads kicked in, and it was pretty clear that they needed a new direction. So, hopefully this new chapter works out for him.
I think he can cultivate some talent down there. I think it's doable.
Yeah. Um, So I guess moving on. So and for Phoenix, reportedly Bill Simmons reports that Kevin Young, right, who is a name that's kind of come up in these coaching circles, right, is probably the guy that's the most likely to get the job. Obviously, again, with rumors, you have to kind of hold on. Um, but again, just in general, it feels like with all the other guys, right, that took other jobs, right, Nick Nurse, right, he went to Philly. Adrian Griffin, right, he went to Milwaukee.
Right.
Reportedly, right, Booker also really wants Kevin Young. So he's probably the guy that's going to get it. Again, I don't really know a whole lot about him. I do know obviously that he's an assistant, right? But
Yes.
again, it seems like that they're closer and closer to maybe, picking their head coach. But we'll see cuz again, like, he doesn't have a huge track record. Obviously, he's relatively young. He's 41. And it seems like there were a lot of teams that were interested in him, but we'll see. Because again, like it's not official yet, but it sounds like he may be the guy that's the
Hmm.
first to get it. Because who's left at this point, right? I guess
Right.
Doc Rivers, right? But again, I don't know.
Nobody wants his playoff
I
record,
would,
man.
yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's interest in him, but if I'm Phoenix, I wouldn't sign him. And then after that, right, it's mostly just other assistants, right? I don't think anybody else who's currently employed is getting fired, right?
Mm-mm.
Obviously, like neither Spolstra nor
No.
Michael Malone are getting fired, right? Obviously, and they shouldn't. So, um, we'll see. But either way, whoever coaches Phoenix, I think again is going to have their hands full because similar to Monty Williams, right? You're coaching a roster, right? That's not going to have a lot of depth. It's very expensive. Has some older injury prone guys in
Yeah.
addition to some young stars, right? But again, you got your hands, tied kind of, and it's a lot of work out there. So whoever gets it, I think, um, obviously, I think you can do a good job with it, but again, it's certainly not easy, right? Just given what you have to work with in terms of the roster. You have some talent, but they still need some upgrades with some depth, um, and other things like that, right? And probably just a little bit more youth, to kind of round out the older guys that are out there,
Yeah.
right? Just to kind of add a little bit of more athleticism, I think. But we'll see. Obviously, we'll get into the more offseason talk with these other teams, right? But either way, the first thing that you have to have is star buy-in, right? So obviously, if Devin Booker, if this is the guy that he wants, to coach him, right, then it would make sense that he's the guy that you go with.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that because yeah, if your star wants him, I feel like you kind of have to play. You gotta please the beast. You just gotta you gotta you gotta get the guy that he wants. And look at Giannis. That the same thing happened there. So I don't know. It should be interesting, but I don't know. It's just I hate talking about this coaching stuff because I'm not too familiar with a lot of these guys, except for like the ones that I grew up with, or the ones that have obviously built a huge legacy for themselves. But like new guys, I'm just not familiar with them, so I can't really like give my own 2 cents on it because I just don't know the repertoire outside of the fact that he was an assistant, like you said. So
Right.
I just got to go with side with Booker, because if that's who he wants, that's who he wants.
And it's always tough, to kind of analyze a rookie head coach, especially when that's an assistant, right? Because it's
Right,
like there's not like a clear cut, line of what is he doing, for the team specifically,
right.
right? Obviously, I'm sure they, can kind of figure out what he's best at, what he's not so good at, but just from the public, right, on the outside looking in, right, because we don't have access to that information. I just don't necessarily know, what his strengths are as a coach, and we won't
Right.
get to see them until he actually gets a head coaching job. Um, but again, like you mentioned with Adrian Griffin, right? The first thing that you probably want is you want your star to buy in,
Yeah.
and that's the guy that your superstar wants. You almost kind of have to do that,
Yeah.
assuming that they're actually a good coach.
Yeah, and it's like if we're talking about, say Kenny Atkinson or, Sam Cassell, somebody who I know, somebody who I know and have a sense of what their coaching habits would be, I could definitely weigh in, but with this guy, like I said, I can't. And, if Booker wants him, he wants him. So pause, but yeah.
Okay, so, uh, all right. So moving on to the next rumor. Um, so according to Shams, it seems like Joe Mazzulla is probably safe. He's going to be sticking around
Good.
as the head coach of Boston. Obviously, we know, his struggles in the playoffs this year. In addition to the team struggles, I think, right? I don't think it's necessarily fair to pin all the blame on Joe Mazzulla.
Not
I
at
mean, some
all.
of it obviously is on him in terms of like, the schemes, the lack of adjustments, but at the same time, he also just had some players that played very poorly. Um, right? Again, if you go back to those games and look at some of the shooting splits for Boston, right, it was pretty bad. Right? Obviously, we mentioned it in previous podcasts, so we don't necessarily have to go into it again.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but either way, again, like how many options again are there, that are significantly better that we know about, right? That would want to come to Boston as opposed to one of those other destinations.
right.
According to Shams, it sounds like the goal is to probably just get him some really good assistance, which I think that makes the most sense if you're planning on keeping him, because obviously you're not getting Udoka back, right? That ship has sailed. He's in Houston, and it sounds like he's going to take some Boston assistance with him. Um, right? So that obviously is not, a great position to be in if you're Boston. But
Right.
either way, um, again, hopefully he's young as a rookie head coach. Maybe he'll learn, maybe he'll get better, right? But obviously Boston, continues to have some questions going into this offseason because again, after Milwaukee got eliminated, it felt like they were kind of the next man up in the Eastern Conference, right? But then, they got eliminated by Miami, even though it went seven, right? Miami was up 3-0.
Right.
So it's pretty clear, right? Boston's got to improve, you know, in a decent amount of fronts, right? And some people feel like it should be the coach, but again, with who? That's kind of the question that I have is just I just kind of need to know, like, right, which guys out there that are that have some realistic Boston ties, right, would be much better. And of course, there are guys that are going to be much better, right? But at the
Right.
same time, um, either way, right? They were kind of just put in a rough position, right, with the Udoka thing, where you're kind of having to scramble, to kind of figure some stuff out, and that's kind of the position that they're in right now. And again, that's kind of an example of just bad luck, right? Because again, if Udoka was the coach, right, would this Boston team have done a better job in the playoffs? Maybe they do. Um,
Could go both
you
ways.
would think, yeah, maybe they do, but at the same time, maybe they don't, just depending on the roster. We'll have to
Bless you.
see. But thank you. But just in general, if this is the move to keep him, obviously getting more assistance, I think, is probably the way to go, just to
Yeah.
help him out. Right? Just
Yeah.
because, again, like you can't necessarily put all of it on a rookie head coach. And we saw some, other rookie head coaches, like we saw Darvin Ham do a relatively decent job in the playoffs compared to what we saw at different points in the regular season. Obviously,
Sure.
there were still some blind spots, room for improvement. But again, with a rookie head coach, kind of like players, there should be a natural progression where you should expect from year to year they get at least somewhat better.
Yeah.
Obviously, with great coaches, usually they start off, where you can clearly see this guy's really good at what he does. But,
Right.
sometimes it takes others a little bit of time, to kind of figure stuff out, especially if they don't have a lot of prior experience, even as an assistant, right? Because again, like usually, we've seen some head coaches, right, have a track record of being an assistant for a while, right? Or in some other types of roles. Um, say like Tyron Lue, right? He was an assistant for a long time before he became a head coach. He didn't all of a sudden just jump into the role of a head coach. So, I mean, I think there's room to grow, right? But either way, it's still a tough position for Boston to be in because I still think Udoka is clearly better, right? But again, he's not coming back. He's not walking through that door. So, you kind of have to figure it out. And this is
Yeah.
probably the best way to go if you're not going to fire him.
Yeah. I agree 100%. I think you do need to keep him around. And unfortunately, I've been on Twitter and Instagram and stuff, and it seems like, a lot of the Celtics fans really are, giving not, they're just giving him hell, unfortunately. And it is what it is, but that's what happens when you're a coach of a franchise like that who has such great expectations. And I've never disliked the Boston franchise. I've just never liked their fandom. So that's my issue with Boston, and I think that's the league's issue with Boston in general. But I feel like Missoula has tough skin. I think he can handle it for sure. And that's why he's coming back. I think and I feel like you said um in previous episodes, you were saying, with Udoka gone, they did lose some toughness, but I I do agree with that. But at the same time, I also think they did lose a sense of their identity because you know um, that toughness was a part of their identity, and now they kind of have to, I guess, rebrand in some way, shape, or form. And you can't rebrand in a year. I don't think that's possible in the NBA. So, once they come back and fortify what they have, I think, Missoula's scheme will definitely be better, especially like you said, with some coaching help, because it seemed like, he was kind of the only guy out there with the plan, but the plan wasn't really that great. You know what I mean? So and I feel it seems like he's a leader, and the guys definitely rallied around him and definitely, helped him with the media when they were kind of attacking him. And it is definitely on the players too, because like you said, some of those guys did not play well. Tatum had some flameouts. Jaylen Brown definitely had some flameouts. Al Horford, like I said multiple times, he looked like he was getting ready to learn Chinese, and he may as well do that. But you know, it, you have to share the blame. The team has to take the blame, and I think they've done a good job at that. And announcing that Missoula is coming back this early is definitely a good sign. So I'm happy with it.
So speaking of Chinese, D'Angelo Russell, just kidding. So
Oh
on to the
boy.
next topic. The Celtics, according to Brian Windhorst, seems like they're gonna extend Jalen Brown. I mean, I feel like this is kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah,
Um, Obviously it's a weird position to be in, right? Because again, 5 years, 300 million, it doesn't feel like he's necessarily worth that. But at the
especially
same
after the
time, right,
playoffs.
exactly. But at the same time, he's also a big part of the team, and you can't necessarily just let him walk,
Right.
right? Because that would probably be worse. Because again, similar to some of these other teams, that we're going to be talking about in a couple minutes, right? You don't get that money back if he walks, right? It's not like all of a sudden you get 50 million or whatever to spend if Jalen Brown walks, right?
Yeah,
So it's just a rough spot to be in because kind of like what we talked about with Golden State. Once Brown and Tatum are on those super maxes, right, that probably pushes them way into that super tax bracket, right, and that's going to make it much harder, to retool and rebuild and just add to your roster. So
sure.
they kind of need to get this offseason right. In addition to the Jalen Brown contract, right? Because after that, once you have him and Tatum, like I said, under the books, it becomes a lot tougher. So this is probably not the obviously I don't mean it like it's the last offseason with Tatum and Brown, but I'm like this is probably the last offseason where like if they don't, make decent improvements and changes to their roster, right? Then this is that might be their ceiling, right? Where they're like a good team, but maybe not necessarily good enough to win a title.
Sure.
But again, like these guys are still young, so we'll have to see. But obviously, like again, as we talked about, it's gonna be I think a relatively interesting and busy offseason for them. Again, I don't think Brown's going anywhere because with that supermax in tow, but still, you got to figure out what you got to do this offseason with some of the other guys. I think.
Yeah. He's been catching a lot of flack, but I think he's there to stay. I think he's an integral part of their team. Definitely a necessity, and it shows you when he plays bad, um, they don't win. So when he plays well, they normally do win. So you know, my thing is there's no reason to break up that duo. I think it's way too early. Would I consider Jalen Brown, top 20? Maybe, but after the playoffs, I don't know. So it's like, we kind of have to gauge his worth on his entire season, not just the regular season. We do have to include the playoffs, so that is kind of scary. But if you have to keep him, I mean, you have to keep him. That's what I'm trying to say. You have to keep him, so you have to do whatever it takes to keep him, even if it is dishing out and doling out huge amounts of money to him. But I feel like with the right squad, and I'm telling you, with the right coach, that team is gonna win a championship at some point.
Yeah, so I guess another Celtics rumor according to the Athletic, Peyton Pritchard, right? Obviously, the younger-ish, I guess, guard for Boston, right? A decent part of their team last year in last year's playoffs,
Hmm.
right? But not really much of a factor in this year's postseason.
Right.
Obviously, with Brogdon coming in, I think that kind of
Pushed
took
him
away
out.
the minutes. Yeah, exactly. That pushed him out of the rotation. But reportedly he wants a trade. Um, so Jay King and Jared uh Weiss, I guess, of the Athletic,
Hmm.
reported that the third-year point guard has quote unquote made it clear he hopes to be traded this summer.
Hmm.
So, like we talked about, right? He was a big part of their team last year,
Yes.
but not so much this year, right? And I think he brings some value, right? He's a decent passer, floor general, right? He's a solid shooter. But I do think it makes sense, right? Because obviously, like, I'm sure he also probably would like to get paid at some point. I don't think he's going to make a ton, right? But
No.
still, um, right? I just, in Boston with Brogdon, with Smart, Brown and Derek White, right? I don't see the minutes for him. So I get that why, so I understand why he would want out because, I don't see the minutes for him. And I think all of those guards are better options than him. I think he's a solid enough player that he could probably help another team.
Sure.
But I do think if you're Boston, right, like again, you don't have a ton of flexibility to make a ton of those types of moves. So I do think that one of them probably should be, figuring out what you're going to do with Peyton Pritchard, right? Probably moving on from him and seeing if you can bring somebody else in, that can help you out, right? Maybe a younger guy, to round out your big rotation or somebody like that, right? But
Right.
I do think it makes sense. It is kind of weird when you hear like, kind of these, lower tier players, right, asking for trades. But
Sure.
again, we've seen it, at different points this season, right? With Jay Crowder, Peyton Pritchard, even say like a Thomas Bryant, right? Where like these guys, they do want contracts and they do want paying or playing time. So, I understand it, but
Right.
and I do think like it's probably mutual for them to move on because again, there's no real point to have him on the roster, if he's not going to play, right? Because again, you have better guards and you could probably just sign, a backup guard for like the veteran minimum in the offseason that could probably, again be like a third string guy for you. So it
Yeah.
makes sense.
It's a business decision, I think, for both parties. Um, Boston, they don't really see a need in keeping him around, I'm sure, due to the fact that their guard room is pretty bolstered up now. And then Pritchard, he's not getting any PT. So it's like, I feel like, and, with Pritchard, I feel like he could be a solid backup on a bad team. Simple as that. I think that's kind of the tier that I would put him on. But, I've always liked his game. I always like it when players, come out of nowhere and they kind of just surprise you. And, he did put himself on the map somewhat. But it's time to move on, especially like I said, since their guard room is pretty beefed up now. Um, but it would be interesting to see him be a backup somewhere else. That would be pretty cool.
The only way he stays probably is if they move one of the other guards, right? Because we
And I
talked
don't
about
think
maybe
there's a point. There's no point in doing that though.
yeah, I
So
mean,
I don't
yeah,
know.
because unless you're, yeah, exactly. Because unless you're getting like somebody at another position that's in a similar tier, I mean,
Right.
we talked about like maybe you move on from Marcus Smart, or Horford or somebody like that. But obviously Horford, it doesn't matter with Peyton Pritchard. But just in general, right? Like
I
all
know
those
what you mean.
guards are better than Pritchard. But
Right.
either way, it's possible. Like maybe he stays, but only if, like I said, one of those other guards get dealt.
Yeah.
And I
I
don't
get
feel
you.
like you. Yeah, and I wouldn't be in a rush to move White or Brogdon.
No, I think
Or
they're pretty
obviously Jalen
integral.
yeah, I think those guys help. Smart, maybe, because again, he's the oldest, I think, other than, well, I guess Brogdon's older, right? But, he does bring other things to the table offensively. And it's probably like, just as a point guard, they're very different, right? Because, Smart is more of a defensive guy,
Sure.
right? But, not as, doesn't bring as much offensively, right? Whereas
Right.
Brogdon's probably a little bit more well rounded, I guess. I mean, he's not as good defensively, I don't think, as Smart, right? But he's obviously a way better offensive player, but
Yeah.
still. But again, there's a lot of decisions to be made for Boston.
Yeah.
Moving on to another Eastern Conference team, it sounds like the Knicks are going to part ways with their GM Scott Perry.
Okay.
Kind of a bizarre decision. I guess it seems like his contract's not going to be, renewed or re-signed or whatever.
Right.
Kind of a weird thing, right? Because it feels like the Knicks have made tangible improvements the last couple of seasons, right? Obviously, they had a long stretch where they weren't making the playoffs. And then they got to the playoffs a couple years ago, right? But, lost to the Hawks when they were the higher seed, right? And then they missed the playoffs last year, right? Took a step back and then, made an upgrade this year, right? Getting Jalen Brunson,
Yes, sir.
right? Kind of setting, the new culture for the team. And they, make the second, they get to the second round, obviously lose in an upset to the Miami Heat, but still a good season for them. And it did feel like there were real improvements. So that's kind of a surprise. I don't know who the guy that comes in is, or maybe like they're, they're just gonna kind of roll with the other guys. I think the move is probably to, give the Worldwide West guy more of, I guess, a say in the organization, right?
Right.
Considering I think he's the guy that was kind of one of the big factors in bringing Brunson over. So, you know, kind of a weird situation, but again, you know, we'll see. Because again, if Wes is the guy that's kind of the main reason, that Brunson is there, then I guess it makes sense. But it's just odd because you don't usually see teams improve and then lose their GM. Usually
Yeah,
that happens, when your team gets worse. Usually they get fired, right?
yeah.
Usually, you don't have a situation where the team improves and then the GM leaves. Maybe he goes somewhere else, but maybe not. I don't know, but just kind of a weird situation.
Yeah, and I feel like weird is kind of the 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 best adjective to describe. I feel like the Knicks, in terms of front office and management and even ownership, I've always questioned their ownership. I feel like Dolan is probably one of the worst owners of all time. Um, Governors, excuse me, but it's weird because like who influences that decision to let that guy go? You know what I mean? Who fires him? Would that be the owner? Do you think? Or
It says,
excuse me,
yeah,
governor once again.
yeah. It just says according to Steve Popper of Newsday, quote unquote, Perry will move on when his contract expires. So I guess they're just kind of just
Parting
going
ways.
separate ways.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. In
Well,
other
it
words, they don't want to bring him back, and
sure. I mean,
yeah.
well, if he was fired, then I feel like that's a different story because like it would be kind of weird. But if he wants to part ways and they don't want him either, then I don't know. That's also still weird. I mean, because like you said, why would you part ways with somebody who helped you significantly improve, to the point where you actually made a pretty decent playoff appearance and playoff run? So, and there's nowhere
Well,
to go but up from here, considering the talent that you have on your roster.
you went to the playoffs twice,
Yeah,
in the last 3 years, right? When they hadn't made the playoffs for several years prior to that,
exactly,
and they won a playoff series this year, so they
exactly.
tangibly improved. And again, that's just kind of a bizarre situation. But
Funky to me.
again, we'll see where the Knicks go because, like, similar to other teams. Again, I feel like they're probably going to be working on stuff this offseason. I think
Sure.
we're going to hear them in a lot of rumors, even if
Yeah.
nothing necessarily comes of it. But obviously they're going to be working
They'll
all
be working.
offseason.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess to go back to that, according to ESPN, the Knicks are hoping Embiid wants out.
Oh
Kind of
joy.
a weird thing considering we talked about, I guess it was maybe a couple of weeks ago. I don't,
I think it was a
it
week
was a,
ago.
yeah, it was like, yeah, I think it might have been the last episode, regular episode, not live stream, but regular
Sure.
episode where it was kind of suggested that the Knicks didn't really want him, or like, not that they didn't want him, but that they weren't looking to trade for him.
Right.
But now, reportedly, now all of a sudden, you know, they're hoping that he wants out. Of course, obviously, we don't know what's going to happen with Philly yet. They just hired a new coach.
Right.
So, of course, they could bring back, Harden, and kind of just go from there. But it is definitely something to keep in mind and keep an eye on because, obviously Philly had a weird playoff run this year, kind of another disappointing year, I guess. And I don't necessarily see how they really improve that much. And so obviously it could get to a point where Embiid wants out. And I guess with the Knicks, you lost out on Donovan Mitchell. So, obviously you're always going to be looking for the next big star. But is Embiid the guy you want if you're the Knicks? I don't know. That's kind of, a tough one for me to figure out.
Yeah. I don't know if Embiid fits, what they're trying to do. I don't even know if he really fits beside Randall. I feel like he would be a great fit behind or next to Jalen Brunson, but with Randall, I'm not sure because then
My
it comes.
guess is that my guess is that Randall probably wouldn't be there long term if
That's
they
what I'm
got.
saying. Because like I don't even know how that would work. Having both of those ball dominant guys and Brunson there. I don't know. It would just be a weird fit. Um, But I mean, if that's what they want to do, then that's what they want to do. But my question is, will Embiid want to go there? You know what I mean? I don't know if that's one of his preferred destinations. I feel like he would want to go somewhere where it's more set in stone that they're going to be contending, and probably making a finals appearance. Because I feel like that's all that's left for Embiid. It's kind of like a similar situation with Jokic, I guess. There's some Embiid stands and there's some Jokic stands, and I guess for people who want Embiid to be in the conversation of one of the better big men in the league, and of all time. I guess a championship is one of the only things he's really missing. So I feel like he would probably want to go to a certified winning team.
You wouldn't want out of Philly and then go to another team, right? That's probably going to be in a similar spot.
That's what I'm
If they have to
saying.
give up stuff, which yeah, because again, it says according to Tim McMahon of ESPN, it just says they're hoping things go haywire to the
Right,
point where you want to leave. So in other words, like it's kind of like wishful thinking for now. We'll
right,
just
right,
have
right.
to
They're just playing PR games, I think.
yeah. So next up, rumor coming from from Jovan Buha of the Athletic. So reportedly, the Lakers would prefer to be in a situation where they would be more interested in moving D'Angelo Russell in a sign and trade or just, moving him than retaining him with Fred Van Vliet as a potential target. This one is kind of a weird one. Obviously, there were kind of talks before they got D'Angelo Russell, right? Where, people were reporting like, maybe they trade for Van Vliet at the deadline.
Hmm.
Obviously, if that was the case, then those talks obviously fell through. Um, but obviously, it is kind of an interesting situation to factor in, right? Because we know that they got D'Angelo Russell, um, right, and in the regular season he played relatively well. Obviously, in the playoffs, had some good games, also had some really rough games. Um, so it is kind of an interesting factor, right? Because again, like it's they're two very different players, right? They're both point guards, I guess, in name only, right? D'Lo doesn't,
Sure.
he says he doesn't want to be a point guard, but regardless, they're very different players, right? D'Lo's more of like a, he can play. I think compared to Van Vliet, I think he's probably a better fit, but also feel like most people would probably say Van Vliet's the better player. Um,
Sure. I feel like it
particularly
depends on who you ask.
Yeah, I think on particularly on the defensive end.
Sure.
But again, it's kind of like what when people mention like say Westbrook versus Buddy Hield, right? Where like Westbrook would be looked at as the better talent, right? Whereas Hield is looked at as the better fit.
Sure.
Um, but it's a weird situation for him, right? Because it's a situation where with Russell, I'm sure he's looking for a big contract, but I don't think the Lakers will want to give him a big contract.
No.
If he's getting like 20 million a year, right? Or, somewhere like, 25 or lower, right? They would probably be okay with that, right? But it's not a contract at this point. I think it's pretty clear he's not looked at as a long-term piece.
No.
Um, right?
Unfortunately.
Because
Yeah.
again, yeah, exactly. So, because again, reportedly they would prefer to sign it to do a sign and trade where they get something else back. But I think it depends. For me, part of it is that again with the Lakers, you have to also look at the cap situation, right? Because again, they're pretty much going to be an over the cap team. And a sign and trade hard caps you and makes it very difficult to build like a legit roster. If
Yes.
it's a scenario where, because I think Van Vliet has a player option. So if it's like a sign and trade where D'Lo goes to Toronto and then Van Vliet just opts in, then I don't really have any problems with that. But if it's a scenario where it's like he opts out and it has to be a new contract and it's a sign and trade and they get hard cap, I don't want any part of that. Um, again, I don't really want any small guards personally, but again, I do understand from some perspectives that there are things that he's better at.
Sure.
But I think D'Lo's the better fit. But also, like, if you're LA, if you have the ability to upgrade from D'Angelo Russell and it's not going to completely hamstring you, then obviously you have to look at it for sure. Because again, they're in a mode where obviously kind of like what we talked about with Golden State, right, where they need to upgrade as well, right? They got to the Western Conference Finals, but it wasn't quite enough to top Denver, right? So obviously you got to get to that point. And again, if there's a move where you have to say goodbye to him and you don't have to again completely hamstring yourselves, then you do it, right? But
Right.
otherwise, we'll have to see. Because again, kind of like what we talked about with the other teams, there's some tough questions to ask if you're LA.
Yeah. And for me, this is interesting because D'Lo is one of my favorite players, but I'll try and keep it short. Um, with D'Lo, I feel like now we can come to the complete consensus. He is not a playoff player, right? I think we've seen this over and over. He doesn't normally do well in the playoffs. He's normally a regular season guy. I feel like he's good in the regular season, decent enough to the point where it's like you don't mind, paying the guy. But when it comes to playoffs and he's on a winning team, it's difficult. But with Van Vliet, he's had some regression. I think, I think that compared to the championship year in Toronto and the year after that, I feel like there has been some regression. But at the same time, I feel like Van Vliet may be better than D'Lo, honestly. In
I
general,
think
in overall as a player, yes, there are some things that D'Lo does better than Van Vliet for sure. But there are also, I feel like Van Vliet he kind of has the edge. And I feel like the Lakers are in a win now mode. They have to be because LeBron's getting older, AD's getting older, and the time is now for them to really potentially, get a ring again. And they need to be competitive. And I'm not sure how much competitiveness D'Lo brings in the playoffs because, like we saw, in every series it was kind of something with D'Lo, whether it be offensively or defensively. So I think they might move on, and that was kind of something that we talked about prior to the playoffs. We said that he was playing for a contract, and now that the playoffs have happened, you do have to factor in his performance into that contract. It's like, do you really want that if you're a winning team? Because any team with LeBron is automatically contending. So I feel like Van Vliet is probably the better option, just due to the fact that probably if he plays next to LeBron, he's going to be better, I think, and I think with Toronto, them missing, Kawhi definitely has hurt Van Vliet in terms of production. Um, so I don't know. And I feel like, Van Vliet could probably be used in situations a little bit better than D'Lo, considering, you have to take D'Lo out of the game when it comes to defense sometimes. So, it's rough. It's a tough decision, but I think Van Vliet is probably the better option. But my question is, will Toronto bite on that? Because I do know that they were looking to move on from Van Vliet, but will they be looking to take on D'Angelo Russell and the things that he brings? So I don't know. It's a tough situation. Like, yeah, it works for the Lakers, but does anybody else want D'Lo? You know what I mean? So that's the
Yeah,
tough thing.
exactly. Because that's the question. Because the question is, what team is going to be willing to give D'Lo, whatever money he's looking for? And I
Right.
don't know what the amount he's looking for is, but I reportedly, right, he was looking for somewhere around like 100 million 4 years,
Jeez,
right?
bro.
So obviously he's looking for big money, but I just don't know how many teams are going to give him that. Because that's the other thing you have to factor in into a sign and trade, right? Is that it has to be both teams that are okay with it. It can't
Yep.
just be the Lakers going like, all right, we're doing a sign and trade. You're going to Toronto, have fun,
Right. That's
right?
not how it
Toronto,
works.
yeah, Toronto has to agree to that as well. And if they're okay with it, right, then maybe it happens. Because again, we've heard this one, kind of like the Kyrie one. We've heard this one before. This one I think is more doable than the Kyrie one, just because it doesn't have to be a double sign and trade. But again, it would also take some cooperating from Van Vliet because again, he would have to opt in to this last year of his option as opposed to opting out,
Right.
signing a new contract. Because again, if he signs a new contract and it's a double sign and trade, that hard caps the Lakers, and that makes it much harder to retain other guys like Rui, like Reeves. And like you said, with LeBron and AD, you have to be in win now mode. You have to be a contender. So that's how you kind of have to weigh pretty much all of your moves, right? Like you can't really necessarily risk having guys, that when it's playoff time, just aren't ready to compete,
Sure.
night in and night out, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of how you have to look at it if you're the Lakers. Like I said, I think going into this offseason, I think we both kind of thought he's probably back, but obviously, it feels like there's more and more possibly a world where he doesn't come back.
Right.
It's just if he doesn't come back, obviously they'd have to be getting something else, right? I don't see any world where he just walks.
Yeah.
Um, unless he's, asking for like some insane amount per year or something
Yeah.
like that. Which again, I just don't see another team giving him like a big max deal. I'd be pretty shocked if that were to happen because
Sure.
we haven't really seen like in the last several years. I feel like teams overall have gotten smarter with a lot of these contracts. Obviously, there's always like head scratching ones, but
Right.
we haven't seen quite as many in recent years where it's like what are you doing, right? Those type of deals where
Luol Dang.
yeah, exactly. Like a Luol Deng and Timofey Mozgov getting, close to max contracts like on day one of free agency, right?
Yeah.
The moratorium period. So
Yeah.
like literally at 12 what was it, like 12:01 AM
Something
or
like
whatever.
that, dude. I was
Yeah,
like, what the
exactly. So
heck?
like a minute. Yeah, a minute after free agency. So that obviously means that those contracts were beforehand, right, negotiated, even though you're
Yeah.
not supposed to. But like stuff like that, right? Like I feel like we don't see stuff like that as much
Right.
anymore. Um, but still, it is definitely a big question because, like you said, with them, they're in win now mode, so they have to, look at every move through that lens, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you're also in a weird spot, right? Because a few years from now, that's probably it. So obviously, you can't sacrifice your future, but so much, right? But for now, as long as those guys are on the team, that's kind of what you have to do, right? And
Well,
that's what they did at the deadline, and that's probably what they should do in the offseason.
yeah. Well, it was fun while it lasted. Sayonara, D'Lo.
So, moving on to another guy, I guess looking for a new contract reportedly, Nikola Vucevic, right? So a different Nikola. He's looking for a new contract. Obviously, we know he's the center for the Bulls. Right, the Bulls, thing, the situation this season was kind of strange, right? Obviously, no more Lonzo,
Yep.
right? Yeah, he didn't play at all.
Nope.
Um, right. Obviously, you have other questions, right, with DeRozan, with Levine, with Caruso, other guys like that. But reportedly, it does sound like Chicago wants an extension. They want to bring him back. Um, kind of, I guess, not necessarily too surprising to me, I guess, only
Mm-mm.
from the perspective of, again, it's another situation where I don't necessarily think Chicago can, like, really replace, him with any other salary if he walks.
Right.
But again, it's also a situation where how much better does he really make your team if you're Chicago? Because again, if you're Chicago, what's the goal here, right? Because obviously, going into the situation when you brought in DeRozan and Lonzo, you were trying to win games, and they were winning games initially, right? Then injuries happened, and that kind of derailed their season. And then obviously it happened again last year, right? And there's some rumors that some people in Chicago think Lonzo may not play again. So obviously, if a situation like that happens, that's awful. But I don't know, because if you're Chicago, they kind of turned it around, I guess, after the deadline, right? Their defense was really good, but it clearly wasn't enough, right? They lost to the Heat in the play-in game, the
Mm-hmm.
final play-in game. And I just don't necessarily see a pathway for them to be much better if Lonzo, can't play. And
Sure.
again, maybe he plays, but we don't know because I think he's still supposed to miss most of next season with the surgery or whatever that he's going to do,
Yeah.
right? So obviously that means you're going to have to assume you're going into next season without him playing. So that's going to be 2 straight seasons. So I just don't really know what you do if you're Chicago. It's just, and again, you lost out on your draft pick, right? That Vucevic trade. That's kind of the other thing, right? Is that clearly they lost the Vucevic trade, so it's almost kind of a sunk cost scenario now, right? Because you gave Orlando 2 lottery picks. I think it was Franz Wagner, and then I guess whomever else they're bringing in this year's draft, right? So again, I don't know. There's a lot of questions for Chicago, and I don't really have a lot of answers to them because again, like me personally, I would just blow it up. But I also
Yeah.
understand, like, you can't just let guys like that walk and not get anything back. But I also wonder, like, again, how many teams would want to pay him like a ton of money? Because again, I do think he's a good player, but is he somebody that's like really worth like 20 million a year for? Like, I don't really think so, but
No.
maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. I think it's a really weird position that Chicago's in, and it's unfortunate because they were a good, fun team to watch when Lonzo was healthy and playing. But it almost feels like he may not play again. But again, I don't know yet.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. Huge deal because like you said, this is more about Vucevic, but we do have to talk about Lonzo because he is a factor. Um. And with Lonzo being out, and if he does come back, you may not get the same Lonzo that you had before. And it's like, will that mesh well with Vucevic? I don't know. And in my opinion, Vucevic is a little bit mid, in my opinion. And I'm not trying to like be, mean or anything, but because he's still a good player, but there's just so much better out there. And, like you said, you got to know your worth. And it's like, I feel like recently he hadn't played that well, so I think it's time to probably move on. I'm not gonna go as far to say is like blow up the entire team, but him specifically, yeah, I don't think he's safe at all. So I feel like it might be time to move on from him.
Yeah. Another Laker rumor. So according to Jovan Buha of the Athletic, Austin Reeves, potentially Spurs may try to look to sign him.
No,
But also reportedly LA is gonna match pretty much up to the max he can get. I think it's about 4 years, 98, close to
yeah,
4 years, 100 billion. Um, I don't know. Maybe the Spurs get him, but I would say probably not. I mean, my
no,
guess is they're probably like more like a spoiler where like they pay him more than the Lakers would probably like to pay him, and
right,
then they're kind of forced into a position where they're going to have to match, a bigger contract. Like obviously they want to keep him, but I'm sure like they would prefer the 4 years 50 million that they can offer versus 4 years 100 million. But I don't think that's like I think a team's going to offer him more than 4 years 50 million. But either way, right? Like it is kind of an interesting conversation because, like we said, LA is kind of in a win now mode, and obviously, again, you can't let this guy walk, like you did with Caruso,
yeah,
because again, he's too good of a player to just let him just leave.
yeah, and he brings a lot of fire to that team. I feel like he definitely stepped up in the playoffs too. Even the regular season, I thought he had a decent regular season. Um, and he's a fan favorite too. So you just can't let guys like that walk. So I'd like you said, I assume they'll match whoever offers him. So I don't think there's any I mean, it's cool because the report said, there's a plan to poach him. That doesn't mean, they're going to get him. It's not set in stone. So that means they're just going to offer him. So I,
Yeah.
it is what it is, but I think he's staying in LA.
The wording's kind of weird, poaching him like the Spurs are like Craven the Hunter or
That's
something
what I'm
like that. I don't
saying.
know.
It's cringe.
Kind of strange.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess kind of tying into this, right? So your man Jake Fisher.
Uh huh.
So
That's our
yeah,
guy.
yeah. So basically another thing that he mentioned is that the Lakers have kind of been given the goal. So I'm assuming when they say given the goal, I think they're talking about like the ownership is telling the front office to avoid the second tax apron, right? So that's kind
Sure.
of like what we talked about with Golden State, where once you're in that salary area, there's very little you can do.
Sure.
So my guess is right is that like they'll probably bring back Austin Reeves. Rui, he'll probably be back unless he gets like a really high offer. Like if he gets like 20 million a year, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
probably gone. They probably don't match that. Um, and then after that, right? My guess is probably one of Bamba or Beasley. Their options are probably declined
Yeah.
because obviously, like ideally, if this was like the previous CBA era, you'd accept both of those options and then you could just kind of use them as trade chips if
Mm-hmm.
you don't want them. But now with the new CBA, I think if they accept those options and they pay Rui and they pay Reeves, like they're going to be in that big tax area, right? So then obviously that limits a lot of the flexibility they can do. And I can understand them not wanting to be in that position, right? Obviously, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're losing valuable players,
Right.
to avoid the second tax apron, right? But obviously, like guys like Beasley and Bamba, they're probably more expendable. But
Sure.
again, like ideally, you'd like to accept them and, trade them, or maybe you decline their options and then you just bring them back on cheaper deals. I don't know, but again, like with these other teams, and we're gonna get into it with probably every team at certain points, right? It's
Yeah.
gonna be a busy off season.
Yeah. It's gonna be a wild one.
Yeah. Another rumor, according to Mark Stein. So it sounds like the Eric Lewis guy, right? As we saw with Game One, he's not refing. He didn't ref Game One at all, and he's not going to be refing in the finals. So they already put out, the list of officials for each game. He's not, on any of those lists. So again, obviously, I don't think the investigation is complete yet. But considering he's not officiating the finals at all, maybe they found something. I don't know.
Right.
Um, but obviously we can't get into it but so much right until we get more information. But for now, because we talked about it last week, right? Reportedly, he's not on the officiating crew for the NBA finals. So obviously, there's movement for that.
Yeah. I think that's the right decision. Keep him away from the from his job for a little bit, considering what has transpired or what has allegedly transpired, excuse me, but
Exactly. Yeah.
that's just a smart move by the NBA. That's just PR.
Exactly. Yeah, and more PR, right? Adam Silver. Apparently he's got a surprise waiting for us after the finals with Ja Morant. Didn't really
Ugh,
divulge into it, right? Because he mentioned, he didn't want to give it attention while the finals are going on, which I understand, right?
all
But
right.
apparently, something's coming. We'll just have to wait until after the finals, to see.
It's going to be hefty. I can feel it if he's talking about it like that cuz that doesn't sound good in my opinion.
And then finally, last but not least, to wrap it up, your Washington Wizards hiring Travis Schlenk, right? So former, I guess, GM or whatever, big position for Atlanta, right? So he
Mhm.
kind of helped put together the Atlanta Hawks at different points, right? He helped lead that offseason, right, where they got all those guys after the bubble, right? What was it was like Gallinari,
Yeah, yeah,
Rondo,
yeah.
drafting Okongwu, right? So that team that went to the Eastern Conference Finals, he helped put together that team. He also had previous experience in Golden State. He's also reportedly the guy that kind of discovered Draymond Green.
Mhm.
So it seems like he's pretty good at what he does. So it seems like his role is he's going to be the senior VP of
Okay.
player personnel according to Woj. So that's a pretty big role, but also like it seems like he's pretty good at what he does. Obviously, Atlanta the last couple of years didn't work out with him. Obviously, right, but I think that was more so like some of the other moves along the margins that they made rather
Yeah.
than like some of the players that they got just kind of just stunk it up
Right.
that they signed in the offseason, right? But that one year, right, which may have just been a fluke, obviously he did a good job there. So, and if you're the Wizards, right, clearly, right, there's a movement going on in terms of getting, guys that are more competent at their job. So, obviously starting with hiring the new guy running the team, Michael Winger. So obviously, I think this is a pretty good hire for the Wizards.
Hmm.
Obviously, we'll have to see, because again, like with these other teams, busy offseason, but I think this is a good start.
Yeah.
In terms of like, it sounds like the owner is kind of like, telling the guy, do what you got to do, right? Because reportedly before he didn't want to tank, and obviously we know where that got them, right? Just the eighth pick of the draft when they could have had a higher
Limbo.
draft pick. Exactly. So I think he's probably learned from his mistake now, and it seems like he's doing a better job of getting more competent guys in there because that's what you want, right? If you're, a team like the Wizards, right? Because again, you're in a position where, in Washington, right, they haven't historically gotten a lot of guys, to come there as superstars, right? They've kind of been in a position where they've had to, draft well, or make really good trades, and it hasn't necessarily worked out the last few years, right? But again, they did make some decent moves, right? Getting Porzingis, right? And for Spencer Dinwiddie.
Yeah.
Getting the guys that got back in the Westbrook trade, even though some of those guys aren't there anymore.
Sure.
But obviously, still, it's a step in the right direction. So overall, I think this is a good move for your Wizard.
Yeah. As a Wizards fan, I'm happy. Um, Hopefully, this guy sees the talent available in the draft. I'd assume he has a big role in the draft. So, I hope we go big and get Jarace Walker, or say one of the Thompson twins is available. Doubt it, but Jarace Walker is probably my pick. Hopefully, we can figure out a way to get some talent influx, because I feel like we do have some guys on there, not to say that don't belong on the roster, but they're definitely better available, I think, even in the free agency, and definitely some guys that we can even like poach, trade wise, even if we spin it right. So hopefully his role in this is definitely more active than previous guys. And like you said, sometimes owners can get or governors can get a little bit personal and treat it like their own fantasy team. And that goes for football and basketball. So, sometimes just, take a step back. You're the money guy, but now let the people who have the rapport with the players and know how to scout, whatever it is, do their jobs. And I think that's a step in the right direction, because it clearly hadn't been working for the past, you know, 2 decades. So, I mean, I don't know. That's just my opinion, but I like this, and my hopes are rising, but at the same time, it's so hard because we've been down in the dumps for so long, and just despair year after year. It's rough because you got to keep in mind Wizards haven't won a ring since like 70 something. So it's rough. There's not a lot of buzz with this Wizards team, but
I
this
think it's
is
second
definitely
or
bright. Yeah, this is definitely a bright spot for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do, like I said, I do agree with that. And again, he's got, some messes to clean up, with the previous
Huge.
front office. And again, like, kind of like what you said, with Leonsis, right? That's his name,
Yes.
obviously. Sometimes, when it comes to building a really good team, you got to have really good ownership. Is they say team governorship? They usually say ownership. That's kind of weird.
Yeah. It
Yeah,
doesn't
but I
matter.
mean, yeah, exactly. Like having, great ownership is a huge advantage, right? You see a lot of these teams, right, that have won titles typically have had, pretty stable, pretty competent ownership,
Sure.
which makes sense because again, they're the people that are making, the money decisions, right, to hire, everybody from the top down, right?
Right.
Obviously, like you said, when it comes to the best ones, they're usually the ones, right, that are kind of hiring other guys to make the other basketball
Look
decisions,
at
right?
Golden State.
Whereas, yeah, exactly. Whereas the ones that usually don't do as good of a job are the ones that kind of try to put themselves in the decision making process, right? Like a Jordan or somebody like that.
Right.
Um, so it's a step in the right direction. So because again, like you said, it's been a very up and down, tumultuous era for the Wizards, right? Because they had that stretch with Wall and Beal, right, where some years they'd be pretty good, and then other years they'd be out of the playoffs.
Right.
Obviously, they had that era in the 2000s, right, with Arenas, Antoine Jameson, right, where they were kind of a decent playoff team.
Sure.
Uh, right, but like you said, outside of those two eras, right, they hadn't really been, they hadn't really done much,
No.
in terms of success, really. Like you said, they hadn't been in the finals or won a title since the late 70s, when they were the Bullets.
Yeah.
Uh,
We weren't even Washington.
Yeah, in Baltimore.
Baltimore. Yep.
Yeah, so obviously, like you said, it's been a weird last several seasons, but hopefully this is a sign that they're getting better. And again, it starts kind of with getting the right people, getting smart people in there to make the smart decisions.
And
And
that's no shade to the owner. Like I love him because he's done a lot for the city, a lot for the squad, obviously. But I just like the fact that he's self-reflecting and taking a step back and saying, like you said, gave him the green light, and that's how it's supposed to be done, in my opinion.
exactly. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. We didn't necessarily expect this to be a super, super long one, but
Yeah,
given the fact that in addition to the game, there were also other things that had happened, since the last time we were together, right? We had to talk about all of it and discuss it with everyone. So again, we appreciate the support. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening. I guess at this point, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. And also, I guess look forward to our live streams following, I believe, game 3 and 4. No
yeah,
live stream after game 2.
yep.
That will just be followed with a regular podcast the next day. So just be prepared for all that. So, like I said, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.